Good morning, everyone. This is Matisse Bruer with YWCA South Florida for Take Action Tuesday on the September 21st. My guest today is going to be Professor Tanya Hernandez, um, author of Racial Subordination in Latin America, the Role of State, Customary Law, and the New Civil Rights Response. Her second book was Multiracials and Civil Rights, and her upcoming book is really exciting on Latino anti-Black bias, racial innocence, and the struggle for equality. Let's just give her a second to join. There we go. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
So I did just give a brief introduction about your two books and your upcoming book. I like how they kind of form a trilogy. Um,
Exactly.
so if you wouldn't, mhm. You wouldn't mind just telling us, a little bit about yourself, and then what we're going to be discussing today.
Okay. Well, I've been in law teaching for over 25 years now, and a lawyer for longer than that. I grew up in New York City to a Puerto Rican mother and Cuban father. So I am very much part of the New Yorkian experience here in the Northeast. But love to go to Florida and many other locations that I consider very Latin American and Caribbean. What else can I tell you about myself? I have been working on issues of comparative race relations for my entire legal career, and it's something that I find very important because I think that people who come to the issues of race and racism from a diasporic perspective, from many cultural perspectives, have a lot to offer. Because I think that people can get very sidelined in thinking that racism only operates one way, and thus there's only one way to address it, losing sight of the fact that, there are many more people involved, and also that some of the mythologies in our own respective sort of silos can be disrupted if we'd only done some of the comparing and the contrasting, because we'd see that we'd be able to readily identify this.
Definitely. So that's something that I've been wanting to bring to my new role here. I'm the director of racial and gender equity at YWCA South Florida, and something that, as a Latina person, something that I find we need to do as a community is root out the ways in which, because obviously, I think a lot of people get caught up in the fact of, well, white supremacy and racism, it affects us too, and we're subordinated in this way and marginalized in this way. But that doesn't mean we can't be perpetuating it. That doesn't mean we can't be also subject to or enforcing biases, and especially anti-Black biases, which I think are probably pervasive and not really discussed. So that's where we have to start, right? Is admitting it, discussing it, understanding what it is. So that's why I'm really excited to be talking to you today.
Well, the other thing I would just throw in there is that another part of the sort of misperceptions is that we come to the United States, our families come, our ancestors come to the United States, and that's when they learn about racism. And if they are racist, it's only because they've been taught it by people, los americanos, in the United States. As opposed to having a much broader perspective about the ways in which we each of us come into this cultural sphere with our own baggage, our own histories, and our own race pathologies. And so it's not that anti-Blackness is something new that is newly discovered.
Right.
Or that we're infected with in the United States that tainted our racial innocence. We already came into the building with a lot of preconceptions of our own.
No, I love that. I love that because I mean, I'm Mexican American heritage, and that's something that was especially part of the mythology of Mexico, right? Is la raza cosmica, whatever, where the best of both worlds, indigenous and European. It's like, well, you're leaving out a humongous part of that history. You know, our African descended people who were brought here against their will. Like we can't disconnect who we are today from the violence that the genocide and against indigenous. There was enslavement of indigenous and African American, our people. So it's those sort of things we can't forget that, and we need to talk about it. We can't just say, oh, we're all hunky dory, we're all this perfect blend, because I think it is great that is something about Latin Americans all across or in the Americas. We are a mix of people, but we need to acknowledge how we got here.
Well, and not only that, I mean, if we wanted to talk about, the science of things, I mean, everybody's racially mixed.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are people who are identifiably, right,
Mm-hmm.
of one spectrum or another, right? So that there's mixtures, but there are also people who, someone on the street, my colleague in sociology, Nancy Lopez, says, your street race is what people eyeball you as, right? So meaning within Latin America and the Caribbean, we've got people we can eyeball as white, black, etc. Right? And they suffer consequences because of where you may find yourself on that spectrum. So it's one thing to sort of celebrate mixture, but it's another thing to kind of put your head in the sand about the ways in which color, phenotype, hair texture, all of these sort of come together and can affect your socioeconomic status and opportunities.
Oh, definitely, because that's one of the main things. Like, you can say race isn't a biological reality because it isn't, but it is a social reality, and it affects our lives in very real and tangible ways. And so, what I wanted to talk about is colorism. What is colorism, and how is that different from just racism?
Well, the thing about colorism is that oftentimes people tend to think of it as something separate and apart from racism. And I like to think of it almost like a Venn diagram. It's a part of. But a way in which to sort of conceive of this Venn diagram is that colorism is all about the reactions to people based on skin shade. Right? But that's not all there is to racism. And that's why I think of sort of colorism as part of racism, not the sort of separate and apart. Why is that? Because racism is also about people pigeonholing you, but barring your access, having stereotypes about you, not necessarily by how you appear. You could be very light, but the moment you open your mouth and you talk about abuelita, having been a descendant of slaves, racism then corners you. Right? It doesn't. People aren't reacting to your skin color, but they're reacting to a racialized notion now of who they think you are because of your ancestry. Right? Now, oftentimes those two things overlap, and so we don't tend to think of them as separate at all, right? Because the very people whose appearance announces their African ancestry, their indigenous ancestry, don't even need to do the verbal reveal, to generate the racism. I think the reason why there's more talk about colorism within Latin America and in the Caribbean is because there is sometimes, I think, a greater willingness to talk about colorism because it gets individuated very quickly. That is to say, oh yes, it's very bad when someone reacts to somebody just based on their skin color because, some of them are really okay. Some of them have the of a white person. So meaning what colorism, the sole focus on color does is it takes away any kind of recognition of systems and structures of inequality. Right? Whereas when you talk about racism, you can get more at the root of the way about perceptions of people based on their group ancestry. Whereas it's easier to dismiss colorism because you can say, oh yeah, that person really shouldn't make judgments based on skin color, while at the same time you never interrogate your very own presumptions and stereotypes because you're busy saying, oh, well, I individuate, I make exceptions, I know which of the good ones are.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense of them being connected and that part of this Venn diagram, what do you think is kind of an individual's role? What can we do to address both of them within ourselves or within our family, our friends, our circle of influence?
Well, I mean, of course, the very first thing is sort of like where we started, right? The acknowledgement, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we are part of both the solution and part of the problem. To act as if, simply because working in the world and somebody hearing Hernandez means that before they even hear me, before they even see me, I've already got some barriers. Like, I acknowledge, right? Like, being Latinx comes with problems in the United States because of the biases. But
Right.
within Latinx, there's so much more going on, right? That is to say, not all of us are equally are situated in the same way. That doesn't mean that we can't be part of the same sort of focus on solidarity, but there is
Mm-hmm.
solidarity if those particular intersectional differences aren't recognized, right? So meaning to say that I believe in Latinx, but at the same time I'm going to step all over somebody because they're of Asian descent within a Cuba, for instance, right? That's not true solidarity if what you're
Right.
got to squash out and homogenize the group in order for us to truly be all together and fighting fighting the fight, fighting the good fight. So I think so that's one of the first things, right? Having these conversations with oneself, becoming racially literate, meaning sometimes people say to me, this is the first time I've ever thought about these things or had these conversations because I haven't been taught this at home. I haven't been taught this in school, right? We are purposely kept racially illiterate, but we don't
Mm-hmm.
stay that way, right? There are these conversations that you are amplifying and elevating here in this space. There's also lots of reading that could be done. Right? I can send y'all a reading list. You can form book clubs, right? There's lots
Yeah.
of ways to intervene into the ignorance, right, that we all have.
Right.
Not that people are stupid, it's that literally they're ignorant. They don't have access. And then after that, once you become literate, then you can start having these really important conversations. You can start interacting with policy issues in a much more purposeful way. So, for instance, we all get the census form every 10 years.
Right.
There's a big brouhaha right now all about, oh, Latinos, they don't understand the categories. They really just only want to mark Latinx, or they only want to mark some other race. They don't want to mark black, white, etc. In addition to the Hispanic origin as the Census Bureau.
Right.
But that's not a space for trying to put us all together and make us then be invisible to the differences. We can't have government intervene into how in people of indigenous ancestry and African ancestry within Latinidad are being subordinated unless we're able to measure and be able to make it visible. This
Right.
is the place where you need to get real about how street race operates, right? You can check Latino. Everybody gets that one. And then answer the race question. Don't start running into the obscurity of the some other box, right? It,
That's a good point. I hadn't even thought of it in that way.
most people don't, right? They feel uncomfortable. They think, oh, if I check white, that means I'm on board with the Proud Boys, right? No,
Right.
checking white simply means that you are creating space for the government to be able to measure how we are all in Latinidad, not always getting equal access, and then
Mm-hmm.
able to create public policy to intervene properly to be able to do so. The census racial data is about being able to measure racial disparity
Right.
and then enforce civil rights laws. If that's not the place to get cute and put in all kinds of I'm from, I don't know, the Game of Thrones world or what have you, in
Yeah.
white box.
No, yeah, no, it's a similar thing I think of as far as in the LGBTQ kind of world as well. When we get into micro labels, because we're all individuals and we all have a different, experience, even within our own families. Like I have a white mom and a Mexican dad, and my sister looks very different than I do. We both have, different ways that we've gone through life. And that, I think some people, they resist the idea of being lumped together. And, but when it comes to, there's a time and a place for everything. As you're saying, the point of the census is to see how others see us, how are that street race, how is that affecting our lives in real and tangible ways. And that's the point of when we're trying to do that. But when we're trying to, you know, join together or talk about different things, then that's where, okay, we're all Latinx, or we're all this, or well, no, actually, we have this particular experience as Mexican Americans in the history of California versus, Florida. So I think the recognition that there's a time and a place, and understanding how is this data going to be used? How can this be used for positive change? I think that's an educational component that's definitely been missing.
Most definitely. Right. It's almost like thinking of how you take inventory in a store. Hmm?
Mm-hmm.
This is not the place where you get all sort of upset that you are a Goya can as opposed to something else. Look, we need to know how many Goya cans are in the store, right? And being able to do the inventory in important ways is about being able to make civil rights law enforcement sort of accessible to us and real.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is a great point and a great way of looking at it. Could we just before, I know we have to go soon, but can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book?
Oh, I'd be happy to. So my editor decided we'd switch the title a little bit. So now the official title, no more changes. Now will be Racial Innocence,
Mm,
Unmasking Latino Anti-Blackness. I know, subtle, but there you go.
I
Um,
like it.
and so what the book essentially does is it tries to sort of build on this kind of conversation that you and I are having right now, and give it as large a platform as possible to build racial literacy. But my mechanism for doing that is disrupting this racial innocence, right, that we Latinos have, like, oh no, not us, not us. We're racially mixed, mestizaje this, and what have you. So to disrupt that innocence and make it very concrete with examples of how we are implicated in anti-Black
Mm-hmm.
racism, with examples from case stories so I tell
Oh.
people stories in housing discrimination, in employment discrimination, in access to public accommodations. Oh, I got a couple of doozy cases straight out of Miami, having to do with access to restaurants with Latino managers, like, not you,
Mm,
based on Blackness, and in the criminal justice system. So I do that in order to sort of make real the ways in which, yes, our identities are rich and complex and multi-layered and have all these tapestries, but at the same time, racism is crude. Racism isn't nuanced, huh? And we are implicated in that dynamic as well. And so rather than only talking at the level of only identity, which of course is important,
mm-hmm.
but I wanted to bring to the table this sort of more systemic structural picture of how Latinos are not only victims of racism, but also complicit in racism.
Oh, that's amazing, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Do you have a publishing date, or is that
Well,
still in the?
the pre-orders will be available in November.
Okay, cool.
Beacon Press is the publisher, so stay tuned.
Definitely. No, that's very exciting, and I'm sure we will be, once that comes live, or we'll be promoting that. I really appreciate you, taking the time to speak with me today, and educating me as well, and as well as our viewers. And I think we all have some homework to do. So thank you so much.
It was my pleasure.
All right. I hope you have a great day.
You too. Bye bye, Matisse.
Bye.